So, to continue our conversation about the revolutions of the Atlantic, we're going to focus in more on the Latin American Revolution part of this. End of the 18th century, so end of the 1700s, revolutionary forces are also starting to kick up in colonial France and colonial Spain. Nation we know of as Haiti today was known as Saint Dominique, or Hispaniola. This was probably France's richest colony. They were known for sugar and coffee. And slaves start to get wind that France is in chaos and they're not going to be able to do anything about it. So you see slaves rising up against plantation owners. There are stories of them killing them, burning houses. And this slave revolt is soon joined by escaped slaves called Maroons. You do need to know what Maroons are. So leading this group is a former slave or escaped slave by the name of Toussaint Louverture. You need to know Toussaint Louverture. He winds up being general, and he's very well read about Enlightenment ideas, and he proves to be pretty capable being a general. He is going to manage to play the French, the Spanish, and the British against each other, while his army of former enslaved Africans and Maroons is going to establish an independent nation. So by 1801, they are going to create a constitution that outlaws slavery and grants equal citizenship to all residents. They institute land reforms where they divide the plantations, distributing the land amongst former slaves and free Africans. He is going to attempt to work with the French on creating a permanent letter of independence, but he's going to be betrayed. He's taken back to France, and eventually he is going to die in France. And his protege, a guy by the name of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, is going to eventually create that Declaration of Permanent Independence. So Haiti's kind of a big deal because it becomes the first Latin American colony to win independence. It's going to become the first Black-led colony and country in the Western Hemisphere, and it's the only country to gain its independence through an uprising of enslaved peoples. So when we look at comparing the Haitian and the French revolutions, some people will argue that the Haitian Revolution is just another extension of the French Revolution because it had been a French colony, but you also have to keep in mind that it's separate. It is kind of its own animal at the same time. Okay, so both of them are going to be based on Enlightenment ideas. Both of them are going to have rights that are limited and restricting the freedom of the people. In France, they're going to get rid of feudalism and they're going to fix that financial problem they had under Louis. In Haiti, they're going to abolish slavery. It's led by enslaved peoples who had no rights at all. But they never economically kind of come back from this. And one of the things that's interesting, I'll have to see if I can dig up the article, but France fined Haiti for its independence to the tune of something like $60 million or something like that. It was a massive amount of money. I want to say it was close to the amount of, interestingly enough, the cost of the Louisiana Purchase. And the idea was that France would France would gain money and Haiti would be beggared. It took Haiti until, I want to say, the 90s before that debt was paid. And it's been brought up several times since then that maybe France should give that money back because they kind of forced Haiti in a position to always be this kind of poor nation, so they could never kind of capitalize on that independence. I'll have to see if I can find the article. It was pretty interesting. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, when we look at the revolutions, the Creole revolutions in Latin America, so anytime you see the word Creole, I want you to think of Spanish America. Remember, the Peninsulares were people who were born in Spain and then came over. The Creoles had European parents. Both parents were of European descent, but they were born in the Americas. So it was technically possible for one sibling to be a Peninsulare and one sibling to be a Creole. Then you also have the mestizo, who one parent is European and one parent is of native descent. And you run into, at the bottom of the social ladder would be the African slaves, the indigenous populations, and people who were of African and either European or native populations. So there's a lot of, we talked before about all the Costa paintings and all the stuff that was done to rigidly adhere people to this kind of social ladder. Well, the Peninsulares don't want independence because they've got all the power. You don't want to give up your power. The Creoles, though, do start pushing for independence because they see themselves as being treated as less than. There are going to be several attempts at revolutions and throughout Latin America. Each of them is going to work out a little bit differently. But at each turn, you have Creoles wanting to separate from the Spanish kind of governorship. Okay, so why is this? A lot of Creoles are wealthy landowners. They do not like mercantilism. This sounds an awful lot like British America. They want more political power, again, like British America. And they resent the fact that Spain tended to give the important government jobs to the Peninsulares, regardless of whether or not they were actually qualified. The fact that they were Peninsulare was their qualification. And then you add to that mestizos. Remember, they were kind of towards, they were of mixed blood with European and native parents. They want any power. They've been getting basically none, and they want a share of that colonial wealth. Many of them had jobs or worked in the mines of the Peninsulares or the Creoles, and often in kind of managerial type roles, but they didn't get to benefit from the wealth very much. So anytime you see a revolution, you're looking for the revolutions where the Creoles and the mestizos team up. That's when they're successful. When it's just the Creoles, it tends not to work as much. Okay, so Bolivier. Simon Bolivier is going to be kind of like the George Washington of the Latin American revolutions. He is a Creole. He's going to push for a lot of those Enlightenment ideas to take place in Latin America. And he is pretty instrumental in the independence for Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru. He was born in Venezuela. Remember, he's a Creole. His family had been aristocrats in Spain, and they had grown very wealthy. And so he had access to this wealth to kind of help his cause. He's going to help gain independence for a large area that he is going to call Gran Colombia. And he's hoping to create a federation similar to what the United States had, where all of these smaller former colonies kind of joined together to become one great nation. That does not happen. His famous document is called the Jamaica Letter. It's written in 1815. He talks about, these Enlightenment ideas, these recovering the rights to which the Creator and nature have entitled them. You have to be, wedded to this idea. Just recognize that the Jamaica Letter is kind of equivalent to the Declaration of Independence. So free markets, no slavery. Most Latin American governments are going to abolish slavery when they gain independence, but they still are pretty conservative when it comes to voting rights and women's roles. And so you kind of have not all that different from the United States in the sense that the people who were in power maintain power, but they do manage to outlaw slavery. So in that sense, they kind of take a step ahead of the US. So in 30 years, you kind of have a map here looking at the differences between kind of who gains their independence. I mean, you go from this green New Spain area to all of a sudden, they're all independent within about 30 years. But keep in mind, each one kind of happens independently, and the Prince of Portugal decides he wants to be King of Brazil, and that is Brazilian independence. Not exactly exciting stuff there. But one of the ones that is kind of interesting is Mexico. Mexico is going to go through several kind of attempts at independence. Father Miguel Hidalgo is going to be the first kind of leader of independence, but he is going to lead the Creole independence, and he does not gain the support of the mestizos, so that does not go very well. Santa Anna is going to wind up losing a bunch of land to the U.S. with the U.S. and Mexican wars, and eventually turning the Rio Grande into the border between the U.S. and Mexico, and essentially losing almost half of what should have been Mexican territory. Mexico's first president is going to be Benito Juarez. He is going to gain power, then lose power, then gain power back. To be honest with you, Crash Course does a really good job of explaining the Mexican independence much better. I get confused because people gain and lose power. So I do want you to steer you to John Green for some clarification. And Strayer does a pretty good job, so if you pull up your access to the Strayer text, that will help you there as well. But really what we look at are the causes and the effects. So you wind up with in the Latin American, the Creole revolutions, new independent nations, and the end of slavery in a lot of areas, and a redrawing of social lines. Governments, however, are often very conservative, with Creoles continuing to form powerful and controlling upper class. There isn't a whole lot of gain for women. Women are not able to vote. They're not able to enter into contracts by themselves. They're held out from educations, and they're stuck in kind of more submissive roles. We will look at the increasing effects or attempts to gain the vote and also education for women in the 19th century. Some later challenges that are going to be faced by Spanish colonialism. Puerto Rico and Cuba were among the final kind of colonial holdings that Spain had. One famous poet from Puerto Rico is going to really kind of push for educational opportunities for women. She's going to become very famous for her critiques of Spanish rule. She gets kind of scared away, and she hides out in Cuba for a while, and then she starts speaking out against Cuba, so she hides out, comes back to Puerto Rico, and then I think eventually she winds up in New York, I do believe. But she's a very outspoken woman, and definitely some of her writings, I think there's an excerpt from one of them in your text that you should read. She's pretty interesting. The Philippines remained a Spanish colony throughout the 19th century, and when you take U.S., you will find out how the U.S. gains control of the Philippines. Filipino students that had studied in Europe learned about the Enlightenment, and they start pushing for Enlightenment ideas and a propaganda movement. You see magazines, other publications and stuff kind of advertising for greater autonomy there, but because of the war with the U.S., well, Filipino independence kind of gets decided without them. So other challenges that you see to colonial control, particularly the British control, the Maori people of New Zealand are going to develop a very rich culture that's kind of become in the eye of the world, the spotlight, with the haka being performed by their international soccer team. And that's even kind of become a thing in pop culture now. I think if I had talked about the haka 5 years ago, I don't think kids would have really known it. But in the recent years, it's become very much known by students, and I think that's to your advantage to help. After colonization, there was an effort to annex New Zealand, and the English control over the Maori is going to increase as it pushes to control their lands. So there's a series of wars, collectively known as the New Zealand Wars. This leads to a sense of nationalism amongst the Maori tribes, but the British, with their superior technology, is going to win over. And you kind of see at this time, one of the things we're going to talk about is an increasing sense of nationalism, where people who have the same language and the same religious and traditions are going to kind of band together and try to draw political lines that align with their belief systems. And that's kind of the shift of what we're going into next with nationalism. You see this with Italian unification. Italy had never really feudalized during the Middle Ages because of their position in the Mediterranean trade. But there is an attempt by Count Camillo Cavour, the prime minister, is going to lead to unite both North and Southern Italy together. Cavour had believed in natural rights. He also believed in the practical politics. He comes up with coins this phrase called realpolitik, where you don't hesitate to take advantage of the situation. You have goals, but you deal in reality. So he doesn't hesitate to kind of capitalize through manipulation. And he's going to adopt this kind of revolutionary philosophy. Giuseppe Garibaldi. Giuseppe Garibaldi was this kind of fisherman in the South who becomes this kind of romantic figure and leading for unification and revolution. But when eventually they are successful in gaining their independence, he kind of takes a step back and says, you know what? I make a good general, but I really don't know what I'm doing when it comes to ruling. So he is going to turn over his, I guess, independence, I guess, for lack of a better phrase. They're going to combine underneath the king of the North and kind of create a united Italy in that attempt. German unification is pretty fascinating. German unification happens as a reaction to Napoleon's invasion. Napoleon forces kind of French language and French practices, and people who were living in what is modern day Germany resented this outsider showing up. And you really see with German unification that push for nationalism. You know, we speak the same language, we have the same belief structures, we have the same traditions. Who is this outsider? Let's team up against him. So you had two main states, nationalists. You had the Prussians and the Austrians. And the Prussians and the Austrians are going to kind of fight over who is going to have the most influence in the German states. And eventually the Prussian leader, Otto von Bismarck, is going to favor this. And he's going to instigate, it's pretty fascinating, German unification. He instigates a war with France over a fake telegram to get people, those dirty French, It's totally BS, but he convinces them, and he preys on their sense of nationalism. And eventually, after 3 kind of instigated wars, he's going to bring about the nation of Germany. In 1871, they start the new German Empire, or the First Reich. So Germany and Italy become 2 kind of new players on this international stage. And you have Great Britain, who is industrialized and has all these colonies. You have France, who had industrialized and had colonies. And so Germany and Italy look at this and they go, you know what? We need to industrialize and we need to colonize. And there is this competition for resources and this competition for alliances that kind of eventually leads to a stalemate, I guess. Nobody wants to pick a fight because they don't want to start something. And this balance of power, that they call it, is going to be achieved for a little while. But eventually, they're also going to wind up being causes that are accepted to lead to World War I. You've got poverty in Italy leading to a lot of immigration of people to the United States and Argentina in the late 19th century. And when you take U.S. history, you will read all about how, it was in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, it was the Italians that were the bad immigrants that everybody hated. It just shifts with the times. At one point, it's the Irish in the 1850s, and then by the 1870s, it's going to be the Italians. Okay, so when you look at this German Confederation, you kind of see how all of these little things, they have to kind of like push everything together. It's a mess. Okay, so starting in the 17th century, there is, we call the sick man of Europe with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans are often portrayed as a bear. And the Balkan states start to push for increasing involvement and contact with European ideas and European concepts of power and the Enlightenment. So as the Ottoman Empire starts to fall apart, there's this real push for new ideas, including nationalism, and people begin to rally around very strong cultural markers, things like language, your traditions, shared history, religion, and eventually Russia and Austria are going to help the Balkans in achieving their independence. But then at the same time, you also have this we call Ottomanism, this aim to create a more modern, a more unified state in the Ottoman Empire. They try to do this by minimizing the ethnic and linguistic differences. They do this by mandating a standard kind of Ottoman curriculum. But it backfires. It really kind of intensifies people's feelings of differences and promoting this concept of nationalism and wanting people to have kind of their own nation. Okay, I'm going to stop here. That should wrap up 5.2 for us.